Dzień dobry Państwu. Witamy na kolejnym, ostatnim w tym roku kalendarzowym seminarium EuroReg. Mamy dzisiaj, myślę, bardzo ciekawy wykład. Będziemy mieć ciekawą dyskusję. Naszym gościem na seminarium jest Tony Levitas, który jest ma wiele ról i wiele twarzy. Jest wykładowcą na Brown University, ale oprócz tego, a może przede wszystkim jest ekspertem międzynarodowym od spraw administracji publicznej, decentralizacji, zarządzania edukacją i w wielu krajach miał okazję w tych sprawach doradzać i w tych sprawach pracować. W niektórych przypadkach pracowaliśmy nawet razem. Dzisiejsze seminarium jest poświęcone zmianom, reformom administracyjnym, jakie zachodziły i zachodzą nawet teraz w czasie wojny w Ukrainie, ponieważ Pan jest ekspertem pracującym w projektach wspomagających reformę administracji Ukrainy, a ponieważ wcześniej pracował przy polskich reformach decentralizacyjnych, to mam, myślę, bardzo ciekawe obserwacje związane z tym, w jaki sposób te reformy, te wysiłki są do siebie podobne, czym się różnią i jakie są podstawowe problemy Ukrainy z decentralizacją na tle, że tak powiem, regionu. Przypominam reguły. Wykład trwa około 45-50 minut. Następnie poprosimy Państwa o zadawanie pytań. Będziemy też zbierać pytania, które będą formułowane przez słuchaczy internetowych i na końcu odpowiadamy, czy Pan odpowiada na wszystkie pytania w formie zbiorczej. Pan dajcie głos.
Dziękuję. Ja mówię jakoś tak po polsku i wdzięczny jestem dla tego wstępu. To jest pierwszy raz, że prezentuję te materiały dzisiaj, więc będę to robić po angielsku, ale dyskusja potem i pytanie może być swobodne po polsku. Ja kaleczę języka, ale wszystko rozumiem i jakoś tak myślę, że będę mógł powiedzieć, co ja myślę. Jak Mikołaj powiedział, wielu lat temu pracowałem dość intensywnie przy polskiej reformie samorządowej. I z tego zaczęło moje życie zawodowe. Jakieś 10 lat temu wróciłem na uczelnię na Brown i wykładuję tam o samorządach, o polityce oświatowej, o polityce amerykańskiej. Przed tym, że zaczynam, chciałbym pytać, ile osób poznaje nazwisko Kulesza lub Lugelski? Okej. To są dla mnie główne architekci polskiej reformy samorządowej, szczególnie Kulesza, cały zbiór i ich nazwisko będą się pojawiać od czasu do czasu. Ale to nie jest tylko pytanie o jeden model tu i jeden model tu. Faktycznie polski model samorządowy jakby było transferowane na Ukrainie w pewnym momencie i o tym będzie rozmawiać też. Okay, with that, let me go to the talk. The talk is divided into 4 parts that basically run chronologically. I'm going to start with the origins of what I think is the fundamental constitutional dilemma of subnational government reform in Ukraine, and that dilemma emerges in the 1990s and is constitutionalized in the 1996 Constitution. Then we have the Orange and Maidan revolutions, in which the Poles not only rushed to Kiev to provide advice, which they've been providing on and off throughout the 90s since the beginning of the start of business. Reforms, the great transformation, as it were. And out of a conversation with Polish reformers and their own needs, Ukrainian local government reformers come up with what is essentially the Polish model structurally of what Ukraine should look like. And that's as a unitary state with 3 levels of local self-government, self-governing oblasts, Moldova, Voivodstva, self-governing rayons, Samorządowe powiaty, I gmina or gmina. That idea emerges and, as we'll see, goes nowhere. And then is revived during the full scale of the first invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the seizure of the parts of the Donbass and the Crimea. And rather remarkably, in the middle of the war, the Ukrainians move forward with parts of this plan. And just as they complete the most arguably fundamental part of the plan, meaning the creation of a universal and comprehensive tier of first level local governments, gmina, Ukrainian, gmina, the second full-scale invasion of Ukraine begins. And the argument is that some of the fundamental problems of the initial constitutional settlement remain to be resolved and will need to be resolved if and when the war ends. There'll be a constitutional moment. And I conclude the talk with my ideas about what that constitutional moment should look like. And spoiler alert, I think it's time for the Ukrainians to abandon the Polish model of a unitary state with 3 levels of local self-government. With that, let me begin. You know, it's hard to go back and remember the origins of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the creation of an independent Ukraine, local government reform in Poland, and all of this, but things happen pretty fast. I mean, Ukraine is a year late temporarily. By March 1990, Poland already has a law on gminas. And in Ukraine, we have the first partially free elections. A year later, in August 1991, Leonid Kravchuk, the first secretary of the Ukrainian Communist Party, refuses to back the coup against Gorbachev. And that's really the moment where it's clear that Ukraine is not, the Ukrainian Communist Party is not coming to the aid of the Soviet Communist Party, and that Ukraine is going to choose independence. A few days later, the Verkhovna Rada, the Ukrainian Sejm, declares Ukrainian independence and invests Kravchuk with presidential powers. And then Kravchuk in December is elected president by popular vote and immediately assumes a set of presidential powers that I'll talk about in a moment. But there's a decision at the moment really of the formation of an independent Ukraine that they're not going to mess with the territorial structure that they've inherited from the Soviet era. And that's 25, the exception here is Crimea, which initially was an oblast. So initially there were 25 oblasts in Ukraine. Crimea becomes a semi-autonomous republic, whatever that exactly means, and the rest of the structure is preserved. So we have 24 oblasts, 24 voivodes, 1,500 rayons, 2 cities of Republican significance, Kyiv and Sevastopol, about 250 cities of what are called cities of oblast significance. These are the larger cities of over 50,000 people. They'll become important in our story going forward. And then the rest of the countryside, and this is a problem that Poland managed to avoid and haunted much of the rest of the region, which is that Ukraine declared, every village and hamlet an independent local self-government. Okay, and these are villages with an average population of about 1,000 people. We can talk about that in the question and answer period, but it's an interesting question about why Poland was able to resist the demand for every village to become a local government, and instead got immediately gmina of reasonable size, preserved an administrative structure that had been inherited but didn't mess with it. Okay, the most important thing is that from the very beginning, the president of Ukraine is given the power to nominate and dismiss the prime minister and to name the heads of what are called local state administrations at the oblast and rayon levels. In the literature, this is called hyper-presidentialism, and hyper-presidentialism refers typically to the ability of the president to nominate the prime minister, and super hyper-presidentialism is when the president has the power to fire the prime minister. The moment that the president can fire the prime minister without the approval of parliament, the government essentially belongs to him or her. Most of the literature on hyper-presidentialism, which is fairly extensive, talks primarily about the relationship between the president and the government. In Ukraine and in other parts of the former Soviet Union, the powers of the presidency also have a territorial implication, and here it is that they name the heads of the regional state administrations, the voivodeship. In many ways, the easiest way to think about this, though it's not one that people like to hear, is that throughout the former states of the inheritor states of the former Soviet Union, with the exception of the Balkans, the office of the presidency took on the functions, the nomenclatura functions of the Communist Party. Okay. And in Ukraine, the decentralization debate is driven more by struggles between the presidency and regional interests than by thinking about which subnational governments should do what. And the decentralization debate is overshadowed by and intersects with a similar debate over the president's power to appoint and dismiss the prime minister and other members of cabinet. Okay, so hyper-presidentialism usually talks about only in relationship to the central government. In Ukraine, it's also about subnational governments. And the debate over decentralization is in large measure driven by people who have ambiguous relationships to the presidents. In practice, these two debates intersect. Presidents need regional bosses to get elected, and regional bosses are often rewarded for their service in getting a president elected by becoming prime ministers. Once they're made prime ministers, there's a perennial tension between the power of the president, who appoints them, and the power of the prime minister as the titular head of government. And throughout the 1990s, through the 2000s, we have a pattern in which the president names a prime minister to whom he's beholden for helping deliver the votes. And then that prime minister eventually supplants his boss. So Kuchma replaced Kravchuk, Yushchenko replaces Kuchma, and Yanukovych replaces Yushchenko. Okay? And hyper-presidentialism is fused in practice with regionally based competitive patrimonialism. Okay, so there's now, alongside the literature of hyper-presidentialism, there's a literature on patrimonialism. I would recommend strongly Madjar Balin's book on the mafia state in Hungary, as well as a new volume they've put out on Ukraine, in which they talk about, the patrimonial states as being run not according to the rule of law and not according to Weberian logics of bureaucratic control, but on the basis of personal connections and informal ties across business, politics, and society as a whole. And the way to think about this is kind of oligarchic clans whose initial powers arose on the backs of the spontaneous privatization of public assets in the 1990s in Ukraine, in Russia as well. And from their capture of major industries, it was not far to the institutions of state power at the regional level, and eventually they move into national politics by extending industrial bases into finance and the media. For lots of reasons, again, an interesting conversation. One of the nice characteristics about the Polish transformation is, despite many fears about the so-called prywatyzacja nomenklatura, Poland did not get oligarchic clans built on the back of state assets. And I would argue that the reason for that is that Solidarity and the workers' councils were strong enough to prevent that from happening, and so strong, in fact, that at the moment the regime collapsed, the national government would have had to renationalize state enterprises to give them away. Right? In Poland, the state could not give away state property without the approval of workers' council. So privatization in Poland was not spontaneous and wild. It was, in fact, very slow at the state enterprise level. Fast in the new starts, but not in the state. In any case, in 1996, the Ukrainian constitution institutionalizes hyper-presidentialism in both this horizontal sense, hiring and firing of the prime minister, and in this vertical sense, hiring the heads of the oblast state administrations, who then hire the heads of rayon state administration. Moreover, the Ukrainian constitution is kind of fundamentally incoherent with respect to its definition of local self-governance. On the one hand, everything is a local self-government. Everything that has been endowed with any form of democratically elected authority is a local government. So the 10,000 tiny villages that have a democratically elected sultan and a population of 1,000, they are local governments. The rayons that have a democratically elected council and a state-controlled executive body or local council, local governments. Oblasts, same structure, state-appointed executive body, democratically elected council, are local governments, and cities of oblast significance, which have a democratically elected mayor, a democratically elected council, and an executive body underneath the mayor. We'll come back to them in a second. In essence, what's going on in the 1996 is that the oblasts are running the rayons. They control the rayons. And they're trying to run the cities of oblast significance. In other words, there's a democratically elected mayor and a democratically elected council, but the heads of key departments at the large city level are still being named by the oblast authority. Okay, so education, health, they're running hospitals, running schools, hospitals, and the head of finance. Up until the early 2000s, were still being named by the oblast authorities, or they had to be approved by the oblast authorities, and they could be fired by the oblast authorities. So you can see there's kind of a dualism all the way through everything that's called the local government. Democratically elected authorities, but executive power running from the presidency's office in some sense all the way down. What are the consequences of this? Well, all public sector functions are considered delegated by the state. There's no real concept of an own function for anyone. There's no clear separation of functions between levels of government. And at each level, you have a state-appointed executive body coexisting with a democratically elected body. Both have separate legal personalities and legal identity, and different areas of decision-making power, which are really complicated to parse, and nobody really understands them, and whether the rules governing them make much difference in practice is an open question that I'd like to understand better myself, but I don't. But largely, it's a bureaucratic apparatus run by the state, staffed by hundreds of people, responsible for the finance of management of things, and a democratically elected council that weirdly is invested with the property rights over state-owned property and the power to name the directors of those institutions. So theoretically, the council would name the directors of schools. In practice, that was not the case in Lviv, where we worked in the beginning of the 2000s. And the council would have the right to make decisions about the disposition of state property. In fact, the LSAs, the local state administrations, the executive bodies of the national government run the show because they control the money and because the councils don't have their own executive bodies. In big cities, with both democratically elected councils and a democratically elected city president or mayor, that's the exception. But as I said, the mayor is presiding over an administrative apparatus that at least initially he doesn't fully control. Key department heads continue to be appointed by the oblast. And even if he controlled in this initial period department heads, the financing of institutions, of schools, of hospitals, of preschools, of social welfare institutions are all being financed by the national government according to normative indicators based on staffing norms or physical inputs. So hospitals get money on the basis of the number of beds they have, the number of nurses and doctors they employ. Schools get money on the number of classes they have. Not on the number of patients, not on the number of students, but on the number of on the institutional characteristics of the object. What this constitutional settlement does is create complete legal, linguistic, and practical confusion about what a local self-government is, right? You know, this is mentioned Kulesza, the Polish architects of Poland's local government movement had a mantra, and their mantra was to be a local government, local governments have to have independent legal identities, that the council is one legal body and the executive is another, but it is a single legal body, that they have independent budgets, so they're not being told to send X amount of money to schools or hospitals on the basis of centrally determined indicators, and that they have property. None of this is really true of any level of local government in Ukraine, according to the 1996 Constitution. There is really complete confusion about who's really responsible for what. And this has really devastating effects in the 1990s and 2000s and to this day, because you have an economic downturn for most of this period. The links to the Russian economy have been broken. The shift to the West is in the process of happening. Large amounts of unemployment, huge amounts of emigration. So you have a fiscal crisis of the state combined with a demographic, what can now be called the demographic catastrophe. And nobody wants to take responsibility for the most difficult decisions that local governments and public administrators have, and that is closing facilities. People remember, and I mean, still the debates are ongoing about, you know, the virtues of small schools. Should small schools be closed? We should close them. Who has the right to close them? The territorial has the right to stop a local government from closing a small school. That was the peace effort. So by the end of the 1990s, Ukraine ends up with the smallest schools in Europe, smallest schools and smallest teacher-pupil ratios almost in the world. So like it's 1 pupil per 8 pupils per 1 teacher, very, very low. And the largest number of hospital beds and nurses per capita in Europe. Underneath this, however, is the situation of these 250, the number keeps increasing because cities apply to be recategorized as cities of oblast significance, where the cities are beginning to gain control over their full executive bodies, the power of the Ministry of Finance to appoint the finance person, and the power of the oblast education department that appoint the head is being removed. The cities get a 60% share of the personal income tax. As in Poland, gmina get 40%, I think, it may have gone up, of the personal income tax. In Ukraine, it's 60%. But more importantly, we can talk about this in the question and answer period. The Ukrainians are allocating the personal income tax not by where people live, and I should add in parentheses, vote, but by where they're said to work. That radically overfunds the big cities. They're doing quite well, thankfully. And as this period of economic decline continues, and as the lines of control from the top to the bottom weaken, the cities have a fairly robust set of revenues, in contradistinction to the oblasts and the rayons. So they're getting control over their budgets. They're breaking out from under state tutelage. But nothing fundamental yet has been resolved. With Yushchenko and the Orange Revolution, Ukraine clearly expresses a desire to move towards the West, to align itself with EU norms, and to reform its subnational governance structure. This is 2004, 2005. Poland is the apple of everybody's eye with respect to decentralization. The reforms are already regarded as wildly successful. Poland is already preparing its newly created self-governing voivodeships to take in EU structural funds. And Ukrainian reformers look to Poland for a model of what they should do next. And they re-envision Ukraine as a unitary state, which, like Poland, should have 3 levels of democratically elected self-government. And under the leadership of a guy named Besmirny, they lay out a plan that calls for the consolidation of the 10,000 villages into 1,500 gramada. So instead of villages, you'd have a town, central town surrounded by villages, and together they would constitute a single local self-government, granting the gramada the same functions and revenues that the big cities have, most importantly in the area of education, calling for constitutional amendments that would create oblast and rayon self-governments by endowing them with their own executive authorities. Okay, so the idea here is to amend the Constitution to say that oblasts are their democratically elected councils and their own executive authorities, which in turn implies that we're going to take the existing state administration, the so-called local state administration, and give some of it over to the newly created local self-government, and some would remain in the hands of the state, like, as in Poland, we have cohabitation. There are state institutions at the voivodeship level, the voivode and the marszałek and the democratically elected level self-government. So both would have their own bureaucratic apparatuses, but you'd have to split the state one into 2 pieces according to which functions are going to which side of the ledger. no sooner have these plans been put out that they begin to unravel. One of the most difficult problems in all of public administration is how to get multiple entities to merge, to consolidate, to amalgamate. And, nobody likes amalgamation. It means the loss of the existing positions in these 10,000 villages. Nobody knows what will happen. Everybody's afraid that the larger unit within the newly amalgamated union would dominate them. They'll lose control over their own destinies. It's the problem from hell, just as closing schools is the problem from hell for any mayor. So they punt on consolidation. It doesn't happen. And they punt on constitutional amendments that would endow oblasts and rayons with their own executive body. So reform a la Polonaise withers on the vine. I would also argue that the Polish model was kind of fundamentally misunderstood in Ukraine, in the sense that the architects of Polish local government reform had a remarkably coherent vision of what they were trying to do, right? And that really is attributed to this group of, I attribute it to a group of administrative lawyers around Kulesza who spent the 1980s essentially looking at Scandinavia, looking at the Swedes and the Danes who were in the process of decentralizing their very centralized welfare states, and doing so by amalgamating very small jurisdictions into larger ones and giving to them new powers, most importantly, the power to run schools. And this group of administrative lawyers centered at the University of Warsaw were involved in a bunch of research projects in Scandinavia. That Scandinavia also finances its local governments through PIC. But Kulesza and company look at local government reform with an incredibly almost technocratic eye, I would say. They're not de Tocquevillian romantics. They don't really believe that people are going to rush to engage in the business of their local governments, though they do expect solidarity elites, the intelligentsia elites, to move into local government if they can make local governments significantly attractive as places to make a career. Very importantly, at the roundtable talks, the Communist Party offered, at the last minute, there was a talk on local a table convened for local government. It's the one table where there was no protocol of any agreement. And the party offered democratic elections at the voivodeship level. And Kulesza and company said, no, we want this from the bottom up. And the slang for this was the czerwone pająk, the red spider at the voivodeship level, where party elites and business elites were intermeshed. Think of Gieryk's Poland. And we don't want to enfranchise that as the first level of local government. We've got to build this from the bottom. And we've got to give local governments independent legal identities, property rights, and their own budgets. And we have to decide what is an own function and what is a shared function with respect to the provision of public service. And in lots of ways, and Kulesh used to say this all the time, the real purpose of local government reform in Poland, as he understood it, was to relieve the national government of having to worry about, where the toilets, whether the toilets flushed and where schools were located. As soon as the national government got involved in that kind of stuff, it couldn't perform its real functions, which were strategic and lawmaking. Ukrainian reformers, on the other hand, see the creation of self-governing oblasts and rayons more than remarkably as tools to break the vertical power of the center, and more particularly, not even the center, but the vertical power of the office of the presidency. And when the constitutional amendments failed, right, when they failed to create self-governing oblasts and self-governing rayons, they really stopped thinking about which functions should go to which level of government. That was an element of their reforms that was always weak and remains weak to this day, because the idea is that it really doesn't make sense to do anything until we can break the line from the president's office down. In any case, between 2007 and 2014, the Besmerti plan, the Polish model of local government reform, grinds to a halt. And then the Russians invade. Then there's Maidan, right? Yanukovych backs out of an agreement to move towards the EU. Hundreds of thousands of people occupy central Kiev. It's essentially a revolution. As soon as the revolution succeeds in ousting Yanukovych, Putin invades the Donbass and Crimea. As soon as he invades, Maidan itself leads to the resuscitation of all sorts of reform agendas that have been put aside since the failure of the Orange Revolution. And the Besmerti plan comes back. And it's interesting that in the moment of the first attack, most of the West, all the pundits, the Soviet, ex-Sovietologists, are calling, like Russia, for Ukraine to federalize as a way to stop the conflict. In other words, give the Donbass and Lugansk and Donetsk, Crimea, independent parliaments, independent, democratically elected parliaments with some sovereign powers, right? That's the difference between a decentralized unitary state and a federalized state. So you can have a very decentralized unitary state, but the center can always take back what is given away, at least in theory. In a federal state, you've constitutionally given some rights, for instance, the right to run your own schools, or the right to determine your land use plan, or the right to sell or consider public assets to who you want. Those become constitutionally protected and cannot be taken back by the central. So the world says to Ukraine, federalize. And in fact, Ukraine, at the worst moment of the initial incursion, agrees at the Minsk Accords to do something like federalization. But they quickly move away from that. As soon as the front stabilizes, they say, no, 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 we're not federalizing, we're going back to our initial idea of municipalization and our initial idea of local self-government reform, and we're going to move to consolidate our 10,000 villages into Prof. And rather remarkably, in the middle of a war, and I'm not sure there's any other case of this, the Ukrainians succeed in getting 10,000 villages to voluntarily consolidate into 1,500 Prof. Voluntarily, this process starts in 2016. Jurisdictions are promised that once they consolidate, they get the same revenues that the big cities get, meaning 60% of the PIT generated by workers on their territories. Plus, they will get incentive grants for joining together. And this process goes on from 2016 and is completed in 2021, okay? Parallel to this, they consolidate the number of rayons from 1,500 to 500. But interestingly, or not surprisingly, the rayons are really gutted of both their personnel and their property, which the newly created Promadas are taking from them as fast as possible. Okay? Efforts to pass the constitutional amendments that would have endowed oblasts with independent self-governments, meaning councils with their own executives and rayons with their own executives, failed for a third time. In fact, there are a variety of different proposals. One makes it into parliament, then gets withdrawn. They're never actually put up for a vote. And you can imagine why, right? You're in the middle of a war, and there's confusion about what a local self-government is, and there's not a whole lot of clarity about the distinction between a local self-government at the regional level and a federalized entity, and that people are rightfully suspicious that the creation of any real autonomy at the regional level will only facilitate Russian meddling and Russian interference. But all of a sudden, Ukraine has viable townships, viable rural communities that are running themselves and are no longer the creatures of the local state administrations at the rayon level. At the same time now, it becomes increasingly clear that the allocation of the personal income tax by place of work is radically underfunding these newly created Prof. So any suburban area where their people are moving to work somewhere else, and any rural jurisdiction where people go somewhere else to work, they're losing all that pay. For the first time, we managed in the spring to get the data, get the state tax authority to give us the data on the allocation of PIT by people's legal residence. And that data is very problematic because people don't register where they're actually living. But according to that data, 40% of all Ukrainian taxpayers commute to work, meaning 40% of the total amount of PIT that should be funding local governments is going to a local government not where the person lives and votes. And that means mostly to the big cities. And we still don't know what to do with oblast and rayon councils, right? That part of the reform has failed. Last act of the story. So just as Ukraine completes its municipalization, Russia launches its full-scale invasion of the country in February of 2022. And much of Ukraine's initial resilience is attributed, rightfully or wrongfully, to its local governments in general, to the new Armada in particular. There are a number of mayors who make historic stands. There are also a few mayors, very few, who greet the Russians with rather friendly. But the overall feeling is that the new local governments have increased the society's capacity to organize itself and to prosecute the war. And oddly, the first 2 years of the war, actually lead to an improvement of the overall financial position of most Armada and of the big cities in particular. The first reason is that there's a huge increase in overall employment because of recruitment to the army. So military pay begins to float local government budgets. Second reason is in the spring of 2022, the local governments led by the Association of Cities, the equivalent of the ZMP in Poland, the Ukrainian Association of Cities, which is a very powerful organization now, convinces the government that they have to increase the pitch share from 60 to 64% in anticipation of rises in energy prices. And then, in particular, there's a huge movement of the population to large cities, large and medium-sized cities in central and western Ukraine, all of which float the budgets of Armada and the budgets of big cities in particular. And you have this weird and paradoxical situation where you get the declaration of martial law and the militarization of the oblast and rayon local state administrations, and increasingly independent financially big cities who are trying to meet the exigencies of the war and now start pulling functions down from the oblast level. So for instance, big cities at one point were given control for ambulatory healthcare and first level hospitals. Oblasts were supposed to have specialized medical units. Similarly, big cities got control of K through 12 education, but oblasts were supposed to control vocational education. Now, the big cities are creating specialized medical units because they can. They have the money to do it. And they're increasingly trying to take over the vocational schools because there's a huge shortage of labor all the way around. So they're pulling functions downwards from the oblasts in practice to themselves. At the same time, we have a general re-centralization of power at the oblast and rayon levels, and a kind of question about what happens next. Which brings me to the last act. You know, the war has produced kind of unthinkable death, dismemberment, displacement, and destruction. You know, and resilience and trauma are kind of two sides of the same coin. I mean, Ukraine is traumatized at many levels. It's really very difficult to talk about the future in any coherent way, knowing what's going on there. You know, it's also a demographic catastrophe. There's no official data on the number of Ukrainians in the country now. I think people have a pretty good idea about that, but it's not a piece of information that the Ukrainian state wants publicly known. The estimates are probably around 30 to 32 million on a good day. You know, that's the loss of Crimea, 1.5 million people, the loss of the Donbass, which is 4.5 million people, and then huge outward emigration. So, you know, Ukraine is getting close to somewhere around half of what it was, according to the last census, Soviet census in 1990. You know, neither the end of the war nor its possible settlement are in sight or easy to imagine. And it's harder still to imagine what a settlement might look like with Trump about to enter office. Nonetheless, you know, Ukraine has to think about its post-war subnational order, not least because recovery, reconstruction, repatriation, and maybe most importantly, EU membership or movement towards the EU will require massive public administration reform. And an EU conditionality is kind of still hanging over lots of stuff that Ukraine does. It's a weird kind of conditionality because in the last instance, it's hard to see the EU refusing to provide funds to the Ukrainians for any reason. And on the other hand, it's supposed to say, you know, you only get the funds if you go forward with your reforms. For the moment, the unspoken assumption of both Ukraine's decentralization reformers and the EU, if not necessarily the office of the presidency, is that the Polish model is still the goal. That our objective after the war is still going to be to create 3 levels of local self-government. And indeed, EU reform conditionalities, even with the war, are still based on this concept. Without, you know, actually specifying you have to have 3 levels, they're in many ways shaped by it. I think that, you know, whether the Polish model is possible or not, any sort of peace will force Ukraine to once again face its constitutional dilemma. And that is, as I've said, you know, should oblasts or maybe rayons be transformed into self-governments by endowing their councils with executive bodies of their own and separating state from local functions at both levels? Or should oblasts, maybe rayons, be transformed officially into what they really are in a confused and dysfunctional way, territorial arms of the national government, by clearly transforming their councils into advisory bodies or eliminating them entirely. My feeling is that the Ukrainians have to abandon the Polish model, and that everybody would be much better off envisioning Ukraine as a unitary state with a single level of municipal self-government, and that the EU should openly support this shift. Why do I think this? Politically, I think it's extremely unlikely that the Verkhovna Rada, 2/3 of the Verkhovna Rada, would vote for constitutional amendments to create self-governing oblasts when they're still operating under the shadow of Russian aggression, short of full NATO membership or absolutely airtight security guarantees. I just don't think the Verkhovna Rada will do this. More prosaically, more functionally, dividing functions between the national government and 2 or 3 levels of local self-government will be much harder than dividing functions between the national government, clearly dividing functions between a national government at the oblast and rayon levels and self-governing remarkably. Again, prosaically, tragically, demographic problems and the shortage of trained civil servants will make it extremely difficult for Ukraine to staff both new self-governments and the rump parts of the local state administrations at the oblast and the rayon levels, while meeting EU requirements for subnational planning and financial probing. The EU is in the process of giving tranches of money for the creation of what's known as the Ukraine facility. X% of the Ukraine facility is supposed to be used to finance subnational projects. The EU has lots of rules about how to ensure that those projects are done according to reasonable planning and reasonable accounting procedures. Putting that apparatus in place to ensure this is going to happen in the middle of a war, in the immediate aftermath of the war, is going to take a huge amount of capacity building that isn't there. As in Poland, the idea about self-governing oblasts, self-governing voivodeships, was that the primary function of the self-governing voivodeship in Poland was to take in EU structural funds and to plan their use. And that regional development should be controlled by a democratically elected entity. Wartime destruction, I think, will render the difference between national reconstruction and regional development pretty much moot. And separating the two is likely to generate conflicts between the national government and self-governing oblasts should they be created. Housing shortages and new services for veterans will require concerted state action at the oblast level. Nobody has any experience with the kind of veteran services that will need to be developed. It's hard for me to believe that that's going to be something that a new self-governing oblast is going to be able to do on its own. The other thing is that big cities in Hromada probably don't want to see a new level of self-government above them. And they'll prefer direct negotiations with the national government over contested competencies going forward. So what should the Ukrainians focus on instead? Strengthening the governance and planning capacities of oblasts and rayons that have been constitutionally declared to be territorial arms of the national government. So resolve the Constitution in favor of oblasts and rayons as state institutions. It is critically important that the pit sharing system be moved to a residency basis, because what's happening now is the big cities are running away with the show, and the rural formato that are supposed to provide for reasonable governance in the countryside are being starved for revenues, eliminating the dualism that runs through all subnational governments and arises from the fact that executive bodies and councils are separate legal entities. This is a very contentious issue in Ukraine, but again, there is no such thing as a single local self-government. There are bodies of local self-governments, the executive and the councils, and their decision-making powers and their rights are different. And the councils hold property. Politically, what I'm basically saying is that Ukraine's decentralizers should be pushing for the creation of a strong state at the oblast and rayon levels, but in return for the thing that has haunted them from the beginning, which is presidential control over them. In other words, the constitutional settlement should pull the president's office out of the business of nominating the heads of local state administrations, as well as the prime minister's. Some steps have been taken about that in the 2000s, and that the EU should support this shift in perspective, saying, from the point of view of rule of law, the most important thing is that the Ukrainian government function as a government and not be run on the side by the office of the president. And with that, I'll stop. I'm sorry for taking so long.
Bardzo uciekała nam mało czasu, 20 minut, więc proponuję to podzielić. 10 minut, żeby zbierać pytania, 10 minut na odpowiedzi. Zobaczę, bardzo proszę się zgłaszać. Studenci. Nie widzę, chwila na zastanowienie. Kasia.
Thank you for this presentation. It clarified a lot in terms of one of the graphs that I have to interpret regarding the rise in public expenditure when it comes to difference between the governmental and local level. The spike for the Ukraine in 2016. And these processes that you described to explain this shift. My question, however, is about the issue of to which extent the human resources of public administration that are Ukrainian immigrants and are placed in Poland, because a lot of the public servants are already of the Ukrainian origin, once because of the needs of the Ukrainian-speaking population to be served by the public administration, and the second because all of these people do see their careers in public administration in general. So taking the example of the Polish entrepreneurs that had their formation years in the UK, and now they're going back to Poland, and the kind of bringing that embedded knowledge and know-how to a Polish economy. Is it the case that there might be an advantage of having the Ukrainian civil servants in Poland possibly transferring this kind of coherent idea of the three layers or the three-tier administration to Ukraine as embodied know-how, possibly? How do you see that maybe happening?
You know, I'd like to believe that that would happen, and that if we had a state in peace, people would return home and take up the process of rebuilding the country and use the skills they've acquired elsewhere. I think, in fact, this constitutional moment, is particularly important because unless they articulate a clear vision of how things are going to work and why people should return, they won't. That said, I'm not sure we're going to see, unfortunately, a stable peace anytime soon. That's one thing. The other thing, is that it's not going to be so easy for people who decided to sit out the war abroad to come back and occupy positions of public authority. There's going to be a lot of resentment. Poland had some of that when people came back after the 80s to rebuild Poland. There was a sort of like, you were here during the worst of it, or not. So I'd like to believe that could be done. I think the European Union has to put a lot of money into training systems for local government officials. I think there's no question that a lot of this is going to have to be gender focused. Should be a huge opportunity for women to move up into public life, but whether I'm optimistic about that happening, I guess I'm not at the moment. And I'm really worried about what the politics of veterans is going to look like after this. So veteran services is something that I would be particularly concerned with seeing somebody invest a lot into, as well as the planning and project management capacities that are going to be needed to take in EU funds in some reasonable way.
Let's take another question.
Yeah. Thank you. That was truly interesting. And I really like your idea about the way in which Ukraine should reform. And I think if there is a need for this, it still can be anchored in Polish history. Because as far as it happens here, we also had municipalities first. And then after 10 years, we had regions and oblasts. So it wasn't in a one moment as well. We had to learn how to operate on 3 levels. It was the first level and the second and the level of voivodeship. So if there is a need for this kind of a narrative, it can be created also on this example. And one question, quick question. What is the relationship now in the system between elected councils in the oblasts level and appointed? Because it's always devils is in details, and sometimes even also in Poland, the shifts is different in different moments and different functions.
It's that the question about what the actual relationship between the councils and the state administration are is a great one, and to which I don't have a good answer, except to say 2 things. The place where the councils have clear decision-making powers are concerned the disposition of property and the appointment of the heads of public entities. Theoretically, they should be approving the budget and doing it. Theoretically, in practice, it differs from place to place. And my general feeling is that in most places, the councils are kind of appendages that are used for different things, some of which is graft and political mobilization. Another thing that is going on is that because councils don't have their own executives and they're reluctant to give power to the executives of the cities, and the cities in turn, everything is most public services in Ukraine are being put in private. So you have a proliferation of private companies at the municipal level to do everything. But yeah, how real the councils are. In some places they seem to play a reasonable role, in other places I think they're completely secondary, and then there's a push and pull around particular interests about property and management that I don't think is particularly functional, but is going on. So somebody has written a small Małbaga Groma połączyło dobrową resztę połączoną odgórnie. Yes, so that's why I put voluntarily in quotes. It's still a hard thing to do, to consolidate jurisdictions, and it almost never happens fully voluntarily.
Tam jest jeszcze uwaga od tego samego słuchacza, że twórcy ukraińskiej reformy bezpośrednio nie odwoływali się do polskiego modelu, chyba czy do szwedzkich doświadczeń.
Yeah, well, I mean, ironically, I worked for the Swedish program in Ukraine, and I guess I would have to disagree in the sense that, the Swedes, the regional level really does one thing, and that's run hospitals. Yes, I think that there was some idea in Ukraine that the oblasts should run hospitals, maybe the rayons as well. Ironically, if the creation of Promadas has been a big success and one of the major reforms, the other big reform success in Ukraine, which Yuri and Anatoly were rather against, was the creation of a single-payer healthcare system. So up until 2015 or 16, the funding for hospitals was given to municipalities who then ran the budgets of hospitals. After 2016, there's a single payer system that provides money directly to hospitals for services, and the cities are still the owners of the assets, like in Poland, Powiats and the city's own hospital facilities, but they're commercialized, and the city's responsibility is in the area of capital improvements. And I think the centralization of healthcare finance in Ukraine has been a big success that isn't talked about enough, but in fact runs against the Hanushak and Chichuk vision of what local governments should be, because they sort of thought that the oblasts and rayons should continue to run hospital budgets.
I'm maybe not an expert in this field, but I wanted to ask about the possible reaction of the European Union on what you propose, having also in mind that it used to be one of kind of, at least from what I remember, the biggest policy of the European Union as the union of regions, and it's more shifting towards the union of national countries, although this is only my perspective of what I'm reading in the press.
So whether this actually goes together with the changes in European Union policies of sort of leaving behind this idea of strengthening the regions. That would be one question. And also I have a second question, because I think in Poland, from my urban planning perspective, the level that is really missing is the metropolitan regions, which of course is a big discussion how to introduce it, but I was wondering whether Ukraine is kind of also thinking about this problem in advance, not maybe establishing municipalities, but more trying to coordinate the metropolitan regions and somehow including that in the reform. Thank you.
Okay, the first question is a good question. I mean, the key is actually very, very weak on subnational governance. It doesn't require any particular form of public administration or any particular form of local government, self-government at all. The bigger issue is that the so-called Charter on European self-governments, to which Ukraine became a signatory in 1997. So I think the EU's position on, what the administrative structure of Ukraine should be is now rather agnostic. When the original Besmetsky plans came out, Poland was the apple of everybody's eye, and self-governing voivodeships looked like the way to absorb EU structural funds, and indeed Poland did extremely well putting that together and getting that process moving and training people how to do the nested planning and accounting. That model did not fare very well in Bulgaria and Romania, and the EU backed away from saying, we really think that planning should be done at the regional level by self-governments, and all sorts of other arrangements were made. And so I don't think the EU is particularly wedded to this tripartite division of public administration, but it is also very unwilling to say, we think we should do something, rethink this problem. Nobody will say that openly. And that is kind of like where I'm trying to stick a stick in the end. And I think in some ways the shift of the EU policy is away from equalizing regions and more, which is kind of shame, and more towards national governments. Is that? Oh, and the metropolitan problem. There is something like metropolitan regions emerging simply because the big cities are, relatively speaking, the agents with the most cash and the most capacity. But whether this is really being thought of in a comprehensive way, no, I don't think so.
Przyglądam się. Można po polsku też? Chwilowo nie ma. Ja może dodam jedno pytanie. Question is sort of difficult, maybe. Do you think that the problem of corruption in Ukraine during last year's war became better or worse?
Okay, so this is a really interesting question, and actually I would recommend the volume that Maja Holland has put together on Ukraine about this. So, this thing that distinguished Ukrainian democracy from, Kazakhstan or other former Soviet inheritor states of the Soviet Union is that the president's power was always buffeted by democratic elections that were largely based on the mobilization of regional oligarchs. So their competitive oligarchy might be the best term for this. In the initial, one of the first things that Zelensky did when he came to power was to pass an anti-oligarch law, which was rather amazing since his own career had been bankrolled and funded by Kolomoisky, who, funded the TV serials Servant of the People and put him on the map, and was also running one of the bigger banks in Ukraine and had his fingers in all sorts of tills. In any case, the initial period of the war saw a pretty strong attack on the plans by saying you're officially an oligarch if you have X amount of assets, Y amount of business in the media, Z amount of positions in politics. You can't do that anymore. You have to give up your media interest or give, and that went a long way to pushing back the plans. Whether there are new ones forming around the war, we don't know. And the risk, I think, is that Zelensky has also been able to put together for the first time a kind of national party. So the risk and the fears of the decentralizers and everybody is that in a post-war world, everything that would be run from the president's office. So instead of competitive oligarchy, it might be a single party state run by the president and his party. That I think is people's fear. Whether that's likely to happen or not, I don't know. I think there's going to be a lot of political friction when a peace is made, if a stable peace is obtained. I think a lot of things will shift.
Dziękujemy bardzo jeszcze raz. Zakończyliśmy nasze kalendarzowe, jeśli chodzi o seminaria, także życzę Państwu wszystkiego najlepszego z okazji, jaką akurat Państwo obchodzicie w grudniu, tych czy innych świąt, więc zdrowia, szczęścia i do zobaczenia w styczniu.